The rain pelted against the windows of Buckingham Palace as William stood in the long corridor, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He had received the urgent call just 2 hours ago. His father, King Charles, wanted to see him immediately. The tone in the private secretary's voice had been different this time. There was something heavy, something final about it that made William's stomach twist with worry. As he approached the ornate doors of his father's private study, William paused. Through the thick wood he could hear muffled voices. His father was speaking with someone, but the words were unclear. William straightened his tie and knocked gently on the door. "Come in," came his father's familiar voice, though it sounded weaker than usual. William entered to find King Charles sitting behind his mahogany desk, looking smaller than he remembered. The years had been kind to his father in many ways, but recent months had taken their toll. Beside the king stood Archbishop Thompson, the palace's spiritual advisor, and Dr. Williams, the royal physician. Both men nodded respectfully at William before quietly excusing themselves from the room. "Sit down, my son," King Charles said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. William settled into the chair, studying his father's face. The king's eyes held a mixture of sadness and determination that William had never seen before. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and lightning briefly illuminated the room through the heavy curtains. "Father, you look tired. Perhaps you should rest," William suggested, leaning forward with concern. King Charles smiled slightly and shook his head. "There will be time for rest soon enough, William. But first there are things I must tell you, things that cannot wait any longer." The king reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick sealed envelope. The royal seal was pressed deep into the red wax, and William could see his father's careful handwriting across the front. His own name was written in elegant script. "This contains my final wishes," King Charles said slowly. "But before you read it, I want you to understand something. Everything I have done, every decision I have made as king has been for the good of our people and our family. What I am about to ask of you may seem impossible, even shocking, but I need you to trust me." William felt his heart rate increase. His father had always been a man of surprises, but the serious tone of this conversation was unlike anything they had shared before. "Of course, father. Whatever you need, I'm here." King Charles stood slowly and walked to the window, gazing out at the storm. "The doctors have given me their final assessment, William. We have weeks, perhaps a month at most. The cancer has spread further than we had hoped." The words hit William like a physical blow. He had known his father was ill, but the doctors had been optimistic just last month. "Father, surely there are other treatments, other options." "No, my son. I have made peace with this." The king turned back to face William, his expression calm. "But what concerns me is not my own fate. It is what happens next. The monarchy faces challenges today that we have not seen in generations. Public opinion is divided. The Commonwealth is questioning our relevance, and there are forces at work that would see the crown reduced to nothing more than a tourist attraction." William stood and moved to his father's side. "We'll face whatever comes together. The family is strong and the people still believe in what we represent." King Charles placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "That is exactly why what I'm about to ask of you is so important. The letter contains instructions that will shock you, William. They go against everything we have been taught about tradition and succession, but I believe they are the only way to ensure the monarchy survives and thrives for your children and their children." William looked down at the envelope in his father's other hand. The seal seemed to glow in the lamplight, and he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. "What kind of instructions?" "Instructions that will require tremendous courage from you," the king replied. "Instructions that may make you question everything you thought you knew about duty and sacrifice. But I need you to promise me something before you read them." "Anything, father." "Promise me that you will consider them carefully, no matter how difficult they may seem. Promise me that you will remember that sometimes the greatest service we can provide to our people is to do what appears to be the unthinkable." William nodded slowly, though confusion clouded his features. "I promise." King Charles handed him the envelope, and William could feel the thickness of the documents inside. "Do not open this until tomorrow morning. Spend tonight with Catherine and the children. Hold them close. Tomorrow, when you read my words, you will understand why tonight is so precious." The storm outside seemed to intensify, and William clutched the envelope tightly. "Father, you're scaring me. What could possibly be so dramatic that—" "Trust me, my son. Trust that everything I have ever done has been motivated by love for you, for our family, and for our people." The king moved back to his desk and sat down heavily. Now go, enjoy your evening. Tomorrow will bring enough weight to bear. William stood frozen for a moment, the envelope feeling heavier with each passing second. His father had turned his attention to other papers on his desk, but William could see the tremor in his hands. The man who had been his anchor, his guide through the complexities of royal life, suddenly seemed fragile and distant. "Father, I love you," William said quietly. King Charles looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "And I love you, my son, more than you will ever know. Now go before I lose my courage." William walked slowly toward the door, the envelope tucked securely inside his jacket. As he reached for the handle, his father's voice stopped him. "William, whatever happens, remember that change is not betrayal. Sometimes it is the highest form of loyalty." With those cryptic words ringing in his ears, William left the study and began the long walk back through the palace corridors. The envelope seemed to burn against his chest, and he could not shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he could never imagine. William barely slept that night. The envelope lay on his bedside table, its presence dominating the room like a silent sentinel. Catherine had asked about his meeting with his father, but William found himself unable to explain the strange conversation. He had simply told her that his father wanted to discuss some royal matters, though the worried expression on her face told him she sensed something more serious was happening. As dawn broke over London, William sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the sealed letter. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up, running his fingers over his father's handwriting. The wax seal felt cold against his thumb as he carefully broke it open. Inside were several documents. The first was a letter written in his father's careful script, dated just 3 days earlier. William began to read, and with each line his eyes grew wider. "My dearest William," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then you have kept your promise to wait until morning. What I am about to ask of you will challenge everything you believe about your duty as a future king, but I pray you will see the wisdom in what I propose." William paused, his heart already racing. He continued reading. "The monarchy as we know it is dying, my son, not from external forces, but from its own inability to evolve. We have become symbols of an outdated system that many of our people no longer understand or respect. The recent polls show support for the monarchy at its lowest point in generations, and this decline will only continue unless we take dramatic action." William set the letter down for a moment, processing his father's words. The king had always been aware of public opinion, but William had never heard him speak so bluntly about the monarchy's challenges. He picked up the letter again. "I have spent months in consultation with constitutional experts, historians and advisors from across the Commonwealth. We have developed a plan that I believe will not only save the monarchy, but transform it into something more powerful and relevant than it has ever been. However, this plan requires a sacrifice that only you can make." William's mouth went dry. He could hear Catherine moving around in the bathroom, getting ready for the day, but her voice seemed to come from a great distance. "William, I am asking you to renounce your claim to the throne." The words hit him like a physical blow. William read the sentence 3 times, certain he had misunderstood. But there it was, written in his father's unmistakable handwriting. "Before you react with shock or anger, please continue reading. This is not about punishment or disappointment. This is about revolution." William's hand shook as he turned the page. "The plan is this. Upon my death, instead of you ascending to the throne as expected, we will announce that you have chosen to renounce your titles and live as a private citizen. Harry will become king, but only temporarily. Within 1 year, he too will renounce the throne, as will his children. The monarchy will then be transformed into an elected position, chosen by the people of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth nations." William stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The morning sun felt harsh on his face as he struggled to comprehend what he was reading. His father was asking him to destroy everything they had been born to protect. He forced himself to continue reading. "You will become the founder of a new type of democracy, William. A system where the head of state is chosen not by birthright, but by the will of the people. You will be remembered not as a king who inherited power, but as the man who gave power back to his people. The first person elected to this new position will likely be you, chosen not because of your bloodline, but because of your character and your sacrifice." The letter went on to detail how the transition would work. Constitutional lawyers had already drafted the necessary documents. Commonwealth leaders had been quietly consulted. Even the Prime Minister had been briefed on the possibility, though no final decisions had been made. The beauty of this plan, the letter continued, is that it preserves everything good about the monarchy while eliminating everything that makes it outdated. We keep the pageantry, the traditions, the ceremonies that people love, but we make the position accountable to the people it serves. William sat back down, his mind reeling. He thought about his children, about the future that had been planned for them since birth. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been raised knowing they would one day serve the crown. Now his father was asking him to take that away from them. But as he continued reading, he began to see his father's vision. The letter described a future where the British head of state would be a global symbol of democracy and progress, where other nations would look to Britain not as a relic of colonialism, but as a beacon of how to evolve and improve. The Commonwealth nations are watching us, William. Many are already considering becoming republics. If we make this change voluntarily, we can lead this transformation instead of being swept away by it. We can show the world that true strength comes not from clinging to power, but from knowing when to change. The final paragraph brought tears to William's eyes. I know this is not the inheritance you expected, my son. I know you have prepared your whole life to be king in the traditional sense. But I believe history will remember you as the greatest leader our family has ever produced, not because you wore a crown, but because you had the courage to put it aside for the greater good. The choice is yours, but I pray you will see the wisdom in this path. William set the letter down and picked up the second document. It was a detailed legal analysis of how the transition would work, complete with timelines and constitutional procedures. The third document was a list of international leaders who had already expressed private support for the idea. As he sat in the growing daylight, William realized that his father had not just handed him a letter. He had handed him the future of the monarchy, of democracy, and of their family's place in history. Catherine entered the room dressed for the day and immediately noticed his pale complexion. William, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. William looked up at his wife, the woman who would have been queen, and realized that everything they had planned, everything they had dreamed of, was about to change forever. Catherine sat down beside William on the bed, her eyes filled with concern as she noticed the scattered documents around him. The morning light streaming through their bedroom windows seemed to highlight the gravity of whatever he had just discovered. Catherine, I need to tell you something, William began, his voice barely above a whisper. But first, I need you to promise me that you'll listen to everything before you react. She reached for his hand, feeling how cold it was despite the warm morning. You're frightening me, William. What did your father give you? William handed her the letter, watching her face carefully as she began to read. He could see the exact moment when she reached the crucial paragraph about renouncing the throne. Her eyes widened and she looked up at him in disbelief. This can't be serious, she said, her voice shaking. Your father is asking you to give up everything we've worked for, everything our children are destined for. Keep reading, William urged gently. There's more to it than just giving up the throne. Catherine continued reading, her expression changing from shock to confusion to something approaching understanding. When she finished, she set the letter down carefully and stared out the window for several long minutes. He wants to turn the monarchy into an elected position, she said finally. He wants you to be remembered as the man who democratized the crown. William nodded. The constitutional experts believe it could work. The legal framework is already in place, and according to these documents, several Commonwealth leaders think it's inevitable anyway. Father believes we should lead the change rather than be forced into it. Catherine stood and walked to their family photos on the dresser. Her fingers traced the frame containing their wedding portrait, where she wore the same tiara that had belonged to Diana. What about the children, William? George has been preparing his whole life to be king. Charlotte and Louis understand their roles in supporting the monarchy. How do we explain to them that we're throwing it all away? Are we throwing it away, though? William asked, joining her at the dresser. Or are we transforming it into something better? Something that actually serves the people instead of just existing because of tradition? Catherine picked up a photo of George from his recent birthday. Their eldest son looked so serious in his formal wear, already carrying himself with the dignity expected of a future king. He's only 10 years old, William. He shouldn't have to understand decisions like this. Maybe that's exactly why we should make this decision, William replied. so he can have a normal childhood, so he can choose his own path in life instead of having it dictated by birth. They were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. George's voice came through the wood. "Mom, Dad, can we come in?" William and Catherine exchanged glances. Their 3 children had always been early risers, and the family often spent weekend mornings together in the master bedroom, talking about their plans for the day. "Just a moment, darling," Catherine called out, quickly gathering the documents and placing them in the bedside drawer. When they opened the door, George, Charlotte, and Louis rushed in, still in their pajamas. Charlotte immediately climbed onto the bed while Louis, their youngest, ran to William for a hug. George, ever the responsible older brother, noticed the serious expressions on his parents' faces. "Is everything all right?" George asked with the maturity that often surprised adults. "You both look worried." William lifted Louis onto his shoulders and sat back down on the bed. "We're just discussing some important family matters, George. Nothing for you to worry about." But George was not easily dismissed. At 10, he was already showing the keen observation skills that would have served him well as a future king. "Is it about Grandpa? I heard the staff talking yesterday about doctors visiting more often." Catherine and William exchanged another look. Their children knew that King Charles had been unwell, but they had tried to shield them from the full extent of his condition. "Grandpa is quite sick," Catherine said gently. "That's why it's important for us to spend time with him and show him how much we love him." Charlotte, now 8, looked up from where she was arranging the pillows on the bed. "Will Grandpa get better? The doctors can fix him, can't they?" William felt his heart break a little. How could he explain to his daughter that sometimes even the best doctors couldn't fix everything? And how could he tell any of them that their entire future was about to change? "Sometimes people get sick in ways that doctors can't fix," he said carefully. "But what's important is that we love them and support them no matter what happens." Louis, only 5, seemed content to play with William's hair and wasn't following the serious conversation. But George and Charlotte both understood that something significant was happening. "When Grandpa dies, you'll be king, won't you, Dad?" George asked matter-of-factly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. William looked at his eldest son, seeing so much of himself at that age. George had accepted his future role with the same sense of duty that William had been taught to embrace. "That's how it's always worked in our family," William answered carefully. "But sometimes things change. Sometimes families have to make difficult decisions about what's best for everyone." Charlotte tilted her head, studying her father's face. "What kind of difficult decisions?" Before William could answer, there was another knock on the door. This time it was one of the palace staff, informing them that King Charles had requested a family breakfast in his private dining room. As they got the children ready to visit their grandfather, William couldn't stop thinking about the conversation they had just had. George's innocent question about becoming king had highlighted the enormous weight of the decision his father was asking him to make. Later, as they walked through the palace corridors toward King Charles's quarters, William noticed how the staff looked at his family. There was a particular reverence in their eyes when they looked at George, the way people look at someone who will one day have tremendous power and responsibility. But there was also something else in their expressions, a kind of sympathy, as if they knew something the family didn't. William wondered how many people in the palace were already aware of his father's plan. When they reached King Charles's dining room, they found him looking brighter than he had in weeks. He embraced each of his grandchildren warmly, asking about their studies and their interests. But William noticed that his father's eyes lingered on each child a little longer than usual, as if he was memorizing these moments. During breakfast, King Charles told stories about his own childhood, about the weight of expectation and the joy of family. The children listened with rapt attention, especially when he talked about learning to balance duty with personal happiness. "The most important lesson I ever learned," King Charles said, looking directly at George, "is that being a good person is more important than being a powerful person. Power should always serve goodness, never the other way around." As the meal progressed, William realized that his father was already beginning to prepare the children for what was coming, even if they didn't understand it yet. Every story, every piece of advice was laying the groundwork for a conversation that would change their lives forever. 3 days had passed since William received his father's letter, and he had barely slept during any of them. The weight of the decision pressed down on him constantly, making even simple conversations with Catherine and the children feel surreal. He found himself studying their faces, wondering how they would look at him after he made his choice. On Wednesday afternoon, William requested a private meeting with Harry. His brother arrived at Kensington Palace looking concerned, having been told only that William needed to discuss something urgent about their father's condition. They met in William's study, a room lined with books about history and constitutional law. Harry settled into the leather chair across from William's desk, his expression serious. "How bad is it?" Harry asked immediately. "The palace staff are acting like they're walking on eggshells, and father's doctors won't tell me anything specific." William pulled out his father's letter and the accompanying documents. "Before I answer that, I need you to read something. And Harry, I need you to promise me you'll read all of it before you say anything." Harry took the papers with a puzzled expression. As he began reading, William watched his brother's face go through the same progression of emotions he had experienced. First confusion, then shock, then what appeared to be anger. "This is insane," Harry said when he finished. "Father wants you to give up the throne so that I can give it up too. He wants us to destroy the monarchy. He wants us to transform it," William corrected. "There's a difference." Harry stood and began pacing around the study. "Transform it into what? A popularity contest? A political circus? The monarchy works because it's above politics, William. It provides stability precisely because it doesn't change with every election." William had expected this reaction. Harry had always been more traditional in his views about royal duty, despite his own rebellious youth. But what if that stability is actually stagnation? What if the monarchy is becoming irrelevant because it refuses to evolve? Irrelevant? Harry stopped pacing and stared at his brother. "Look at what father has accomplished as king. Look at the charitable work, the environmental initiatives, the diplomatic relationships he's built. How is any of that irrelevant?" "It's not about father's work," William replied. "It's about the future. The polls show that support for the monarchy drops with every generation. Young people see us as outdated symbols of inequality. Half the Commonwealth nations are considering becoming republics." Harry picked up one of the constitutional analysis documents and flipped through it. "So instead of fighting to show them our value, we just surrender. We hand over 1,000 years of history because some polls show declining approval ratings?" William stood and moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens. "What if surrendering is actually the most courageous thing we can do? What if showing that we trust the people to choose their leaders is exactly what proves our value?" "And what about our children?" Harry demanded. "George, Charlotte, Louis, my own kids? We're supposed to tell them that everything they've been taught about their heritage and their responsibilities was meaningless?" "Not meaningless," William said, turning back to face his brother. "Different. Instead of inheriting power, they'll have the chance to earn it. Instead of being born to serve, they'll choose to serve." Harry sat back down heavily in the chair. "You're actually considering this, aren't you? You're actually thinking about giving up your birthright." William returned to his desk and pulled out another document he had been working on. "I've been researching what happened in other countries that transitioned from monarchy to elected heads of state. Ireland, Germany, Israel. In many cases, the change strengthened democracy and improved international standing. But those were different circumstances," Harry argued. "They weren't voluntary transitions led by the monarchs themselves." "Exactly," William said. "Which is why this could be so powerful. We wouldn't be forced out by revolution or political pressure. We would be choosing to evolve, showing the world that true leadership means knowing when to step aside for the greater good." Harry was quiet for several minutes, rereading portions of their father's letter. Finally, he looked up at William. "Have you talked to Catherine about this? What does she think?" "She's struggling with it just like we are," William admitted. "She understands the logic, but she's worried about the children, about giving up everything we've planned for. And the Prime Minister, Parliament, do they even know about this plan?" William nodded. "Father has been having quiet conversations with key leaders for months. The constitutional framework is already in place for such a transition. It would require legislation, but the legal experts believe it's entirely possible." Harry stood again and walked to the bookshelf, running his finger along the spines of various history books. "You know what the ironic thing is? If we do this, if we actually pull this off, we'll probably be remembered as the most important royals in British history, not because we were great kings, but because we chose not to be kings at all. Does that thought appeal to you? William asked carefully. Harry was quiet for a long time. Part of me has always wondered what it would be like to live a normal life, to have my children grow up without the constant scrutiny, the endless protocol, the weight of expectation. He paused. But another part of me thinks we'd be betraying everyone who came before us. William joined his brother at the bookshelf. Or maybe we'd be honoring them by showing that we learned the most important lesson they could teach us, that serving the people is more important than serving tradition. They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Catherine entered, followed by one of the palace staff. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Catherine said, "but there's been a call from Buckingham Palace. Your father wants to see both of you immediately. He says it's urgent." William and Harry exchanged glances. They had been so absorbed in their discussion that they hadn't noticed how late it had gotten. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the study. As they prepared to leave for Buckingham Palace, Harry grabbed William's arm. "Whatever Father wants to tell us, whatever deadline he's about to give us, I need you to know something." "What?" "If you decide to do this, if you choose to renounce the throne, I'll support you. Not because I think it's right, and not because I'm convinced it will work, but because you're my brother and I trust your judgment." William felt a surge of emotion. Despite all their differences over the years, despite the tensions and disagreements, Harry was still willing to stand with him. "And if I decide not to do it?" William asked. Harry smiled slightly. "Then I'll support that decision too. Either way, we face whatever comes next together." As they walked through the palace corridors toward their car, William realized that his father's plan had already begun to change their family in unexpected ways. The prospect of giving up the throne had somehow brought him and Harry closer together, forcing them to think about what really mattered beyond titles and traditions. But he also knew that the most difficult conversations were still ahead. Whatever their father wanted to discuss tonight would likely force them to make a final decision, one that would determine not just their own futures, but the future of the monarchy itself. The drive to Buckingham Palace felt longer than usual, despite the roads being nearly empty in the evening traffic. William and Harry sat in silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what their father might want to discuss. The weight of the decision hanging over them seemed to fill the car like a thick fog. When they arrived, they were immediately escorted to King Charles's private chambers, rather than his official office. This was unusual for evening meetings, and it made both brothers more anxious about what they were about to hear. They found their father sitting in his favorite armchair by the fireplace, wrapped in a burgundy robe despite the warm evening. Dr. Williams, the royal physician, was packing up his medical bag, and his expression was grave as he nodded to the princes before leaving the room. "Sit down, both of you," King Charles said, his voice noticeably weaker than it had been just days earlier. As William and Harry settled into chairs across from their father, they could see how much his condition had deteriorated. His skin had a grayish pallor and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his teacup. "I assume you've both read my letter by now," the king began, looking directly at William. "And I assume you've discussed it together." "We have," William replied, "though I'm not sure either of us fully understands what you're asking of us." King Charles smiled slightly. "I'm asking you to be braver than any king in our family's history. I'm asking you to sacrifice personal glory for the greater good of our people and our nation." Harry leaned forward in his chair. "Father, with respect, how do we know this is the right decision? How do we know that destroying the monarchy won't cause more harm than good?" "We don't know," the king replied honestly. "But we do know what will happen if we don't change. The monarchy will slowly fade into irrelevance. Support will continue to decline. One by one, the Commonwealth nations will become republics. Within 50 years will be nothing more than expensive tourist attractions." William had been studying his father's face throughout this conversation, and he could see the effort it was taking for him to speak. "Father, perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow when you're feeling stronger." "No," King Charles said firmly. "Tomorrow may be too late. The doctors have told me that I have perhaps a week left, possibly less. If we're going to do this, the arrangements must be made now. The words hit both brothers like physical blows. A week. William had known his father was dying, but hearing such a specific timeline made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. Harry's voice was barely a whisper. A week? King Charles nodded slowly. Which is why I need your answer tonight, William. The constitutional lawyers need time to prepare the documents. The Prime Minister needs to be fully briefed. And most importantly, we need time to prepare the children for what's coming. William felt the room spinning slightly. Everything was moving too fast. Father, this is the most important decision in the history of our family. How can you expect me to make it in a matter of hours? Because sometimes life forces us to make important decisions quickly, the king replied. And because I believe you already know what the right choice is. You're just afraid to make it. William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where tourists gathered every day to catch a glimpse of royal life. What if I'm wrong? What if this experiment in democracy fails? What if the people choose leaders who destroy everything good about what we've built? Then we'll have learned something important about democracy, King Charles said, and we'll have done so by trusting our people rather than fearing them. Harry had been silent during this exchange, but now he spoke up. Father, if William does this, if he renounces the throne, I need to understand exactly what happens next. The letter says I become king temporarily, but what does that mean in practical terms? King Charles reached for a folder on the side table next to his chair. Inside were detailed timelines and procedures that had been worked out by constitutional experts. You would be crowned in a simple ceremony, nothing elaborate given the circumstances. You would serve for exactly 1 year, during which time you would work with Parliament to establish the legal framework for the transition to an elected head of state. And then I renounce as well? Harry asked. Yes. And in doing so, you become the last king of England in the traditional sense. You and William together will have transformed monarchy into something new, something better suited to the modern world. William turned back from the window. What about public reaction? The people who support the monarchy, who see it as part of British identity, won't we be betraying them? Some will see it that way initially, the king admitted. But I believe that most people, when they understand the reasoning behind the decision, will respect the courage it took to make it. We're not abandoning our duty to serve. We're finding a new way to serve. The king struggled to stand, and both his sons immediately moved to help him. He waved them away gently, but accepted William's steadying hand on his arm. There's something else you need to know, King Charles said. Something that might help you make this decision. Dr. Williams has just informed me that my condition is progressing faster than expected. I may not live to see the transition completed, which means that if you choose to go through with this plan, it will be up to you and Harry to see it through without me. William felt tears stinging his eyes. The thought of losing his father was devastating enough, but the idea of managing such a monumental change without his guidance seemed impossible. We can't do this without you, William said quietly. Yes, you can, King Charles replied firmly. You're both stronger and wiser than you realize. And you'll have each other, along with the best constitutional minds in the country to guide you. Harry stood and joined his father and brother near the window. If we do this, there's no going back, is there? Once we renounce our titles, once we transform the monarchy, we can't change our minds, no, the king confirmed. Which is why the decision must be made with absolute certainty. Not because you think it might work, but because you believe it's the right thing to do regardless of the outcome. William looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. Somewhere out there were millions of people whose lives would be affected by whatever decision he made in the next few hours. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. I need some time to think, William said finally, and I need to talk to Catherine one more time before I give you my answer. King Charles nodded. Take all the time you need. But remember, my son, that sometimes the most courageous act is not holding on to power, but knowing when to let it go. William and Catherine sat in their private garden at Kensington Palace long after midnight, the children safely asleep upstairs. The night air was cool, and the only sounds were the distant hum of London traffic and the gentle rustling of leaves in the ancient oak trees that surrounded their home. Catherine held a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, while William stared up at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. They had been talking for hours about his father's ultimatum, going over every possible consequence of the decision he was being asked to make. Tell me honestly, William said, breaking a long silence. If I do this, if I give up the throne, will you be able to forgive me for taking away the life you thought we were going to have? Catherine set down her cup and turned to face him fully. That's not the right question, William. The question is, can you forgive yourself if you don't do it? Can you live with knowing that you had the chance to change history, to transform the monarchy into something truly democratic, and you chose tradition over courage? William had expected many responses from his wife, but not this one. You think I should do it? I think you're the only person who can make this decision, Catherine replied carefully. But I also think that everything I've learned about you over the years we've been together tells me what choice you're going to make. What do you mean? Catherine smiled slightly in the darkness. You've never been able to walk away from doing what you believe is right, even when it's difficult. Remember when you insisted on serving in the military, despite the security risks? Remember when you became an air ambulance pilot because you wanted to serve in a meaningful way? You've always chosen service over comfort. William reached for her hand. But this is different. This affects you, the children, our entire family's future. Does it, though? Catherine asked. Or does it simply change how we serve? Your father's letter talks about you likely being elected to the new position. If that happens, we'll still be serving the British people. We'll still be representing the country internationally. The only difference is that our authority will come from the people's choice rather than from birthright. They sat quietly for several minutes, both lost in thought. Finally, Catherine spoke again. I've been thinking about George, about the pressure he's already feeling at 10 years old, the way he studies protocol instead of playing like other children, the way he carries himself with such seriousness because he knows he's going to be king someday. He's handling it well, William said, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. He's handling it because he has to, Catherine corrected. But what if he didn't have to? What if he could grow up knowing that if he wants to serve his country, he'll have to earn that privilege through his actions and his character, not just inherit it? William turned to look at his wife, seeing her more clearly in the moonlight. You're saying you want me to do this? I'm saying I want you to follow your conscience, Catherine replied. And I think your conscience is telling you that your father is right. The monarchy needs to evolve or it will die. Before William could respond, they heard footsteps on the gravel path leading to their garden. A figure emerged from the shadows and they were surprised to see Harry approaching, still dressed in the same clothes he had worn to their father's meeting. I'm sorry to interrupt, Harry said as he reached their seating area, but I couldn't sleep and I needed to talk to both of you. Catherine gestured to an empty chair. Of course. Sit down. Harry settled into the chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded Catherine of how William looked when he was stressed.
I've been walking around London for the past 3 hours, thinking about Father's plan.
And I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Which is? William asked. That he's right, Harry said simply. Not about every detail maybe, and not about the timing, but about the fundamental idea that the monarchy needs to change or become irrelevant. William was surprised by his brother's words. This afternoon you seemed completely opposed to the idea. This afternoon I was thinking like someone who was afraid of change, Harry replied. But tonight I've been thinking like someone who actually cares about the future of this country. Harry leaned forward in his chair, his expression intense. Do you know what I realized during my walk? I realized that if we don't make this change voluntarily, it will eventually be forced on us. Public opinion will shift so far against the monarchy that Parliament will have no choice but to abolish it entirely. And when that happens, it won't be a planned transition guided by constitutional experts. It will be messy, angry, and destructive. Catherine nodded slowly. Your father mentioned that several Commonwealth nations are already considering becoming republics. Exactly, Harry said. Australia, Canada, even some of the Caribbean nations. They're all questioning whether they want King Charles III or King William V as their head of state. But what if they could choose their own head of state? What if the transition to an elected system actually strengthened the Commonwealth instead of destroying it? William had been listening carefully to his brother's arguments, and he could feel his own resistance beginning to crumble. What changed your mind, Harry? What made you go from opposing the plan to supporting it? Harry was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I was walking past Westminster, and I saw a group of young people protesting outside Parliament. They weren't protesting anything specific about our family, but they were holding signs about inequality and representation, and I realized that to them, We represent everything that's wrong with the current system." He paused, looking out at the garden. "But what if we could change that? What if instead of being symbols of inherited privilege, we could become symbols of democratic progress? What if the British monarchy could lead the world in showing how to transition from hereditary power to elected leadership?" Catherine reached over and squeezed William's hand. "It would be an incredible legacy. It would also be incredibly risky," William pointed out. "If the transition fails, if the new system doesn't work, we'll be responsible for destroying something that has provided stability for over 1,000 years." Harry leaned back in his chair. "But if we don't try, if we just let the monarchy slowly fade into irrelevance, we'll be responsible for letting it die through our own inaction." The three of them sat in contemplative silence as the night grew deeper around them. Finally, Catherine spoke. "William, I think you need to stop thinking about this as a choice between preserving the monarchy and destroying it. What your father is proposing isn't destruction. It's evolution." William stood and walked to the edge of the garden where he could see the lights of central London in the distance. Somewhere out there, his father was spending what might be his last night as King of England, waiting for an answer that would determine the future of the crown he had dedicated his life to serving. "If I do this," William said quietly, "I want both of you to understand that there's no guarantee it will work. The people might elect someone completely different as the new head of state. We might go from being the royal family to being ordinary citizens with no special role in British society." "Would that be so terrible?" Catherine asked gently. William turned back to face his wife and brother. "No," he said, and as he spoke the word, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. "It wouldn't be terrible at all. It might actually be exactly what this country needs." Harry smiled for the first time that evening. "So you're going to do it?" William looked up at the stars, thinking about his father's words about courage and service. "Yes," he said finally. "I'm going to do it." The morning sun streamed through the windows of Buckingham Palace as William walked slowly down the familiar corridors toward his father's chambers. In his hand, he carried a handwritten letter containing his decision. The weight of what he was about to set in motion felt heavier than any crown he would never wear. He found King Charles sitting up in bed, looking surprisingly alert despite his worsening condition. Dr. Williams had just finished his morning examination and was quietly updating the medical charts when William entered. "Good morning." "My son," King Charles said, his eyes immediately focusing on the letter in William's hand. "I take it you've made your decision?" William approached the bed and handed his father the letter. "I have. But before you read it, I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm proud to be your son, and I'm grateful that you trusted me with this choice." King Charles opened the letter with trembling hands, his eyes moving carefully across William's words. As he read, his expression shifted from anxiety to relief to something approaching joy. "You're really going to do it," the king said softly. "You're going to transform the monarchy." "We're going to do it," William corrected. "Harry and I together with your guidance for as long as possible." King Charles set the letter aside and reached for his son's hand. "I knew you would make the right choice. I knew you would have the courage to put service above tradition." They were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Catherine entered, followed by Harry and the three children. The family had agreed that King Charles should hear their decision first, but they wanted the children to be told about the major changes coming to their lives as soon as possible. "Grandpa," George said, approaching the bed with his characteristic seriousness, "Mom and Dad said you wanted to see all of us together." King Charles smiled at his eldest grandson. "Yes, George. There are some important things we need to discuss as a family." The next hour was one of the most difficult conversations any of them had ever experienced. William and Catherine, with help from King Charles and Harry, explained to the children that their grandfather was very sick and wouldn't be with them much longer. They explained that this meant big changes were coming for their family and for the country. Charlotte, typically direct for an 8-year-old, asked the question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Does this mean Daddy won't be king?" William knelt down beside his daughter's chair. "It means that Daddy has decided there's a better way to serve our country than being king in the old-fashioned way. We're going to help create a new system where the people choose their leaders." "But what about me?" George asked quietly. "I've been learning to be king my whole life. What am I supposed to do now?" William moved to his son and put his hands on the boy's shoulders. "Now you get to learn to be something even better than a king, George. You get to learn to be a leader who earns people's trust instead of inheriting it. You get to choose your own path in life. To everyone's surprise, George's eyes lit up with interest rather than disappointment. You mean I can decide what I want to be when I grow up, just like other children? Exactly like other children, Catherine said, sitting down beside her son. Though if you still want to serve your country when you're older, there will be many ways to do that. Louis, still too young to fully understand the conversation, was more interested in playing with the medical equipment than discussing constitutional changes. But Charlotte had more questions. Will people be angry at us for changing things? She asked. King Charles answered this one. Some people might be confused or upset at first, Charlotte, but I believe that most people will understand that we're doing this because we love our country and want what's best for everyone. Over the following days, as King Charles's condition continued to deteriorate, the family worked together to prepare for the most unprecedented transition in British constitutional history. Constitutional lawyers worked around the clock to draft the necessary legislation. The Prime Minister and key parliamentary leaders were briefed on the plan and agreed to support the transition. Public relations experts developed a strategy for announcing the changes to the British people and the world. The announcement would come in stages. First, the news of King Charles's death and the normal transition to William as king. Then, after a brief period of traditional mourning, William would make his historic announcement about renouncing the throne and transforming the monarchy. King Charles died peacefully on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by his family. His last words were spoken to William. Remember, my son, that true kingship is about serving others, not ruling them. You will be the greatest king we have ever had, even though you will never wear a crown. The funeral was held a week later, with all the traditional pageantry and ceremony that the British people expected. William was officially proclaimed King William V in a brief ceremony, though he knew he would hold the title for only a matter of days. 3 days after the funeral, William stood before television cameras in Buckingham Palace to address the nation. The speech he gave that evening would be remembered as one of the most important in British history. My fellow citizens, he began, I stand before you today not just as your king, but as someone who believes deeply in the power of democracy and the wisdom of the British people. My father's final wish was that I share with you a vision for the future of our constitutional monarchy, a vision that he believed would strengthen our democracy and our nation's place in the world. The speech went on to explain the transition plan in detail, emphasizing that the change was not a rejection of tradition but an evolution of it. William announced that he would serve as king for exactly 1 year, during which time Parliament would establish the legal framework for electing future heads of state. The public reaction was mixed, but largely positive. Younger Britons overwhelmingly supported the change, seeing it as long overdue modernization. Older citizens were more skeptical, but appreciated the careful, respectful way the transition was being handled. International reaction was fascination and, in many cases, admiration. Democratic leaders around the world praised Britain for taking such a bold step toward greater equality and representation. Exactly 1 year later, William stood before the same cameras to make his second historic announcement. Today I fulfill the promise I made to you 12 months ago. I hereby renounce my claim to the throne and dissolve the hereditary monarchy. In 6 months, you will have the opportunity to elect your new head of state in Britain's first democratic transition of this kind. The election campaign that followed was unlike anything Britain had ever experienced. William chose to run for the newly created position of President of the United Kingdom, competing against candidates from across the political spectrum. His campaign focused on unity, service, and the continuation of Britain's democratic evolution. He promised to use his experience and international connections to strengthen Britain's position in the world, while ensuring that the office remained accountable to the people. On election day, William won with 65% of the vote, making him the first elected president of the United Kingdom. In his victory speech, he reflected on his father's words about true kingship being about service. Today, the British people have given me the greatest honor possible, he said. Not the honor of inherited power, but the honor of earned trust. I promise to serve you not because I was born to do so, but because you have chosen to believe in me. Years later, historians would mark William's decision as the moment when the British monarchy transformed from a symbol of the past into a beacon for the future. Other nations began following Britain's example, creating their own transitions from hereditary to elected leadership. George, Charlotte, and Louis grew up to become remarkable adults, each choosing their own path of service to their country and the world. They often spoke of how grateful they were that their father had given them the freedom to earn their own place in history, rather than simply inheriting it. And in the end, King Charles's final wish had been fulfilled. The monarchy had not been destroyed. It had been reborn as something even more powerful than it had ever been before. The crown had been replaced by something far more valuable, the freely given trust of the people.